Hey guys, it's me, Anchor64 with another video. This time what I'm going to talk about is more of a discussion video, so not really guide or something, or maybe something in-depth about Classic WoW or something. Um, More often I think this like general discussion thing, you maybe saw it already from the title or so. Like the topic will be about how like the loot in Classic WoW and also by extension I would say TBC is pretty unique. How they made the gear, and that is pretty much got never replicated by anything else. And that's also why everyone pretty much likes the loot in Classic WoW and so much, and everyone remembers it that fondly. Doesn't really have to be nostalgia thing. I think, for example, for me personally, this is like the first time I play Classic WoW, but I still remember like every single piece. I know, okay, oh, that one's Onslaught Girdle, it's important, and so on. Or, oh, that guy is Thunder Fury, and so on. And I think this is something that is got really lost, especially in later expansions. That situation where what you have is where you have certain pieces that are like very, very important, very big high ticket items, and you can see it and you know, okay, that guy knows what he's doing, or maybe got lucky or something. Or maybe he has a lot of gold when we had GDK piece. So yeah, this will be more of a relaxed video where we'll talk about loot from the different expansions, how it got changed, and why that is important, especially for things like raid situations, for things like, okay, why is no one doing the older raids anymore? What is the problem? And yeah, pretty much that. I think it's pretty fun to talk about stuff like that, even though it won't really have any any impact on anything. But I still think it's like pretty fun to just talk about Classic WoW a bit. This is like some of the stuff that is pretty much my favorite thing, just talking about Classic WoW and so on. So yeah. First of all, we need to start with Classic. Also, of course, if you like these kinds of videos, feel free to subscribe and like. I kind of forget to say that, but yeah, let's actually get started with the actual video. Relax, sit back. I won't really make any high edits or timestamps or anything, so this will be just a free improvised video. But yeah, first thing I would need to start with is of course Classic WoW. Classic WoW is probably I would say, yeah, it's not really an expansion, but I always call it that. It is pretty much the iteration of WoW where gear is, I think, has like the most identity by any expansion. Even though most people would say, okay, it's pretty much only a nostalgia thing, but I wouldn't say it's really true. There are a lot of things why that one, like why the gear in Classic WoW is so impactful and has such a big identity. Nostalgia is a thing, but I think there are also other way more important things that go into that. First thing also as well, how you get gear is actually very interesting in Classic WoW. Classic WoW is pretty much the only iteration of the game where you have things you could even do like outside raids, besides PvP of course, which still would give you like best in slot items. I think that is not really true for others. Yeah, other iterations of the game. Unless maybe you want to count things like badges and so on, but I don't really count that. I think just pure item. What I mean by that is, for example, for this whole video, I will pretty much talk as a Fury Warrior perspective, because that is what I'm most familiar with. So you will have that perspective. I think, but for other classes and so on, it's also true. So if you are starting out, I'm also using this online board just to visual some stuff. Let's say you start out, you are here, you're just your warrior, maybe your normal gameplay, you hit level 50. So what can you do when you are hit level 50 as a warrior? You of course can do your class quest. What do you get from your class quest? You get Diamond Flask. Diamond Flask. And for people who know it, Diamond Flask is your best in slot trinket for the whole game. You get that at level 50. Isn't that interesting? That is the thing that is never done in other expansions. You can't get something even below your maximum level, which is best in slot for the whole game. Maybe there is, maybe I forgot something. Feel free to comment it as well. As always, give your own opinion and so on as well. I will pretty much read it. It's always interesting to see other opinions, or maybe you agree or something. But yeah. That is, I think, just really insane. Of course, you can also get other stuff in dungeons as well. So, what other stuff we could get? Hodge or Hands of Justice would be another big item. This item, again, you can get in a dungeon and it will take you very, very far. You will pretty much only replace it with like Breakfang Talisman, but still, it's a very, very strong item. That is something that isn't really done in later expansions, which is kind of interesting. Another thing, of course, you could also talk about PvP. I would say there are only two game iterations where you can get very, very strong gear by doing PvP, unless I'm missing something in retail, but yeah, I'm not that familiar in retail. So that would be like classic WoW with like the ranking gear. You see like everyone having, for example, running around with ranking gear, because it's very, very strong and pretty much on the same level like AQ gear. Another thing you have is, of course, as in TBC, you also have very strong PvP gear, which is also very good in PvE. Which would be like the arena gear you can get, like the swords are your best in slot, I think, in phase 1. And they get like stronger and stronger. And they are always very, very good alternatives to PvE gear you can get in, like by doing arena and stuff in TBC. Which I think will become very important when we actually enter TBC. I will also try my best to do some arena in TBC to get maybe some of the gear. I didn't really do it before, but yeah, I will look at it. So yeah, that said, you can also get very good gear in PvP. However, the most important thing is raid progression. And in Classic WoW, it looks pretty much like this. So you would start, let's say, on here. Before you enter raids, you get maybe your previous. And then you enter MC, which is, I would say, probably a pretty big jump. But if you look at MC gear in detail, so let's do that instead. So let's look at some of the gear. So let's say we have maybe Striker's Mark. So Striker's Mark's, for example, one of the first things you can get, would be pretty high up here. But then we have other gear, like maybe the tier gear you can get in Molten Core, which would be like way lower on the priority list and is pretty bad. And then you have things like Onslaught Girdle, which is like way up here. And as well as maybe Vendor Strike is, of course, like we don't really use it. We have things like Quick Strike Ring, which is again way up here. Thunder Fury is also way up here. So we will have these spikes. Gear, it's like the difference between having Thunder Strike and maybe Thunder Fury. Vendor Strike and Thunder Fury, or Shadow Strike if I want to use the official name, is pretty important. Not really important, but it's very vast. Like the difference between the singular gear pieces. So you could go into the Molten Core run and don't get anything, or maybe only get like shit pieces that you don't really care about. And you could enter Molten Core gear where you get maybe Onslaught Girdle, you get maybe Quick Strike Ring, Striker's Mark, and you are pretty much done for these slots for multiple phases. Which is one thing that is very insane. And that's like only in the first phase. So if we just look at the progression, we would say maybe here, let me actually zoom out a bit. So we would maybe start here, then we would maybe do Molten Core, then maybe Blackwing Lair releases, and I think Blackwing Lair is pretty much with the gear on the similar level as Molten Core. We have like pieces, for example, like Chromatic Boots and DFT, which are highly contested and very good items, but still there's nothing like, I would say, Thunder Fury. There's no Onslaught Girdle. We have like more pieces in Molten Core which are like more important. But this is more of a general level, so Molten Core will also stay on the same level. Then we have AQ, which is kind of a big jump. And then we have next round, which is just a way bigger jump. But actually let me type in MC, for example, here. as well as Blackwing Lair. But what we can do is we can pick point the certain like singular items. So the big ticket items, for example, let's say Onslaught Girdle. So this one would be OSG. Let me actually do this. And we have as well as Quick Strike Ring. We have Thunder Fury, which is even like goes even higher. So let's go Thunder Fury. Goes pretty much up here, like even above Nex. And all of this would pretty much also go into here as well. So this would be OSG, Onslaught Girdle. This would be like the ring, Quick Strike Ring. This would be Thunder Fury, and so on. So you have gear in the first phase in the game, which is pretty much best installed for multiple phases. You can skip pretty much like this gear doesn't get replaced in AQ. This gear doesn't get replaced in ZG. This gear doesn't. Maybe gets replaced in next Rammers. Thunder Fury doesn't get replaced at all. If you get it, you are good for the whole game. This is one thing which is very unique to Classic, and I would say also in some iterations also in TBC. But after that, this never actually happens again. Unless maybe you want to count some legendary items. I counted Thunder Fury, but Thunder Fury you can get in the second phase of the game, or you can actually like get the bindings in the first phase. But if you really like want to complete it, you actually need to wait until Blackwing Lair for some Elementium or Elementium bars. But still, this is the thing I said again isn't really replicated. And as well, we have some gear as well in AQ, which is also very good. But the thing is, you can go into MC, get some gear, and you are good for like multiple phases. What this will lead to is people doing the older raids, even if they are maybe in next Rammers, or if as well, especially if they are in AQ. So this one would be AQ. You would still go into MC just to get maybe a Thunder Fury, just to get an Onslaught Girdle, to get a Quick Strike Ring, things like that. And that is very, very important for player retention, for raids being actually viable and being useful even in later phases. Because you don't want to have people that just only do the newer stuff. For example, often in retail, a new phase comes out, all of the gear in the earlier phases is pretty much irrelevant again, and people will only do like the newer raids. Unless you want to count things like mounts and transmogs and whatever. But here, this is more of a natural thing, where people will still do like the older raids just because the gear is very, very good. I think this is an important thing that needs to be like available. I think this is also a pretty important thing for like, if we get things like Classic Plus, we don't want to invalidate older gear by much. That's one thing. And we will want to have like pieces in older raids and so on that are still very important in later phases. Because what you don't want to have is a new phase comes out and everything becomes irrelevant again. So yeah, this one is very important. I could also type next here. But yeah, that's what I pretty much wanted to talk about like here on Classic WoW. The gear situation is very, very unique. Also, I could mention here in dungeons you also have things like this, which goes pretty much also on here, which would be Diamond Flask, which you can get in a dungeon. But yeah, also another thing. All of this is pretty much still relevant until the latest phase. It can become a bit boring because you won't really replace it when you have it, so you will reach your best in slot a bit faster. But you also need to consider we have like 40, we do 40 man raids, so not everyone can get these items. But yeah. So why is it also important? It is very important for new players actually. So let's say you have new players that come into the game in later phases. And of course what they want to do is, of course they want to do the earlier content as well. Because maybe they can't really do the new content with just their gear, with like maybe greens and so on. So they actually want to gear up a bit. Maybe they actually want to see the older content. And the problem is, if you have new people that could join a guild but maybe that guild doesn't really want to do the older stuff. Let's say we wouldn't have things like OSG, Quick Strike Wing and whatever, we would have these kind of items in later phases. Let's say you would maybe all of these items that are very good would be in here in AQ maybe, or maybe even later in Nex. So let's say what would happen with new players, they would maybe join, they want maybe to do Molten Core, Blackwing Lair, but they see everyone only doing like AQ, Nex and so on, and then no one's doing Molten Core and Blackwing Lair, which is a higher entry barrier for newer players, and also becomes kind of sad because maybe these people wanted to do the older content. But if you don't have anyone hosting these groups, newer players of course 100% won't be hosting older raids. Like, let's be real, that's not something that will pretty much happen, especially if people are new. So yeah, that's the thing why it's very important to keep older raids alive and still be playable. It doesn't need to be where you actually are just very highly forced to do them as well, especially if they are kind of annoying like Molten Core, but still, you still want to have to keep them alive, especially in later phases. So yeah, that's pretty much that for Classic. That's pretty much the situation where gear is very unique in Classic. Why that is the case is because the developers, they didn't really have a plan by doing their items. They pretty much did the items just by hand, improvised a lot of stuff, and that's why you have things like On-Stock Girdle being a best installed build for the whole game, and then you have like Vendor Strike, which pretty much gets instantly sold or disenchanted because it's so useless. But yeah, they didn't really have a plan, they didn't really have something printed out where you needed to follow gear by a certain standard, and I think that's also very healthy and fun and interesting for the game, because then you get gear which has a lot of identity actually. Everyone kind of knows about On-Stock Girdle, Brutality Blade, Thunder Fury, stuff like that, because these items are pretty cool actually. So they have their own identity around it. And they're also very strong, that's also another thing. If these items were really strong, they would be kind of infamous like Shadow Strike or Vendor Strike. But that item is also very known, because it's so bad actually. These are things that aren't really the case in later expansions. So if you are going to retail and maybe you're asking a retail player, can you name the item, the weapon or so you are using right now, they probably won't know. Like the name and so on, because the gear has become so solved, so formulaic, which I will get into where it actually started to become very formulaic. But yeah, that is a pretty big problem. So now I talked about Classic. Maybe your question would be, okay, how does it look like in TBC? We will enter TBC. On the Classic Anniversary realms, they will go into TBC. Maybe you didn't see like the roadmap. It got pretty much announced when Classic Anniversary servers got launched, and we got the roadmap. You could see, okay, these will be entering TBC. Actually, the reason is why we even got Classic Anniversary is because a lot of people actually ask about TBC, and yeah, pretty much that. But let's look at TBC. TBC, what they did in TBC is they kinda tried to solve the gear situation a bit, where you don't have a lot of discrepancies between gear, where you have pieces, for example, like Vendor Strike, Shadow Strike, which are very, very bad. You don't really have that in TBC. So we don't really have pieces that are very, very trash. You have still some very bad pieces, but like the range between very good items and very bad items is kind of a bit different actually. So yeah, we have like the amount of very bad items isn't actually that big. Another thing is they kind of try to solve stats as well. So we won't really have items with kind of weird or strange stats as well. So yeah, that's another thing. However, one thing they really kept is just with general, like the stats being pretty grounded around like the Classic level. Of course they are like higher, that's one thing, but still it's not that different. If you see maybe DPS numbers between like TBC and Classic, they are pretty similar actually. That's also because they didn't really inflate the stats that much. One thing that, however, did is we don't really have anything percentage based anymore. We only have stats, raw stats. That's pretty much also they needed to do that. For example, if you would enter TBC with still like classic item which give you, for example, 2% hit, why would you ever like replace it? That can't really work in that on that mind. So yeah, it makes sense to have it to convert it to stats instead. So for example, hit chance became hit rating. That's one thing. But yeah, they still try to keep the itemization in mind in vanilla, just to optimize it a bit and make it make more sense. So let's actually just go over that. There are no things where you can get, for example, in dungeons or maybe at level 60 or so that are best in slot for the whole game. So things like Diamond Flask or something don't really exist in TBC anymore. That's one thing, for example. However, what you can do is you can still do a lot of PvP, which can net you a lot of really good gear, which is still useful in PvE. So that's one thing. For example, the arena gear is very, very strong in phase 1 and also later phases as well because it gets upgraded. We have things, however, that got introduced, which also were a case. I think it's really important to have that as well, where you can get items outside of raids, which is still very, very strong. You had a situation, I talked about this, for example, like Diamond Flask and Classic, but you also have things like Lionheart Helm. This item you can get by BS, by blacksmiths, armor smiths in specific. So very, very good helmet, pretty much your best in slot helmet for the whole game. And you get that outside of raids. You just either need a lot of gold, maybe need to receive and craft it yourself. There are a lot of different ways you can get this item. But yeah, all warriors, for example, want it, of course. You get that outside of raids. That is very important. You want to have items that are very, very strong you can get outside of raids. Why is that the case? Because you need to do, like for this, you need to do overworld stuff. So I would say stuff on the overworld. That's not something I wanted to do. So let me go back again. Yeah, stuff on the overworld. What I mean by that is either you need to farm a lot of mats, you need to either farm gold, or maybe you do some shady stuff and get your gold from somewhere else. Maybe you try to get the receipt. Like maybe if you are a blacksmith yourself. Things like that. You can't really do this in a raid. You can't get Lionheart Helmet in a raid. I think that's very important. That's something that TBC took by heart. And for example, for blacksmiths, you can get... I didn't actually have it here, but give me a second. This one. So this mace you can get by being a blacksmith. You can only use it as a blacksmith. And you need to farm a lot of materials for it. It's not that intense as... Or maybe I would say it's pretty... Yeah, it's a bit less than Lionheart Helmet. But yeah, this mace is very, very strong and pretty much your best in slot mace you will use in phase 1, for example. Because the effect is very strong, has good amount of damage, blah, blah, blah. I won't really get into it that much. But you get it by being a blacksmith. A mace smith by specifically. The change, however, is that you need to be a blacksmith to use it. You can't really sell it or something. That's the change they did. But still, this is stuff that is outside the raids, like outside from the raids. You actually need to farm a lot of stuff, or maybe need to farm a lot of gold to actually afford that. And then you have it. And you have a very good mace, and you didn't maybe enter even one raid. Which is, I think, very important to have it. Because this will lead to people farming, like the overworld being alive and such. And it will lead to people being like less raid loggy. So they won't raid log as much. So yeah, that is very important, I think, in my opinion. Another thing they took from Classic WoW is big ticket items. I always say it like that, big ticket items. What I mean by that is items that are very, 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 very good. And you definitely want to have it. And they are best in slot for multiple phases, and they are just very, very strong. We had stuff like Onslaught Girdle, Quick Strike Ring, Thunder Fury, lot of stuff. But same thing in TBC. We have Dragon Spine Trophy, or DST in short. We have Belt of 100 Deaths. 2 items you can get in earlier phases. For example, Dragon Spine Trophy, you can get that in phase 1. And that one is best in slot, yeah, like your best in slot trinket until the last raid. Same with this belt, best in slot until the last raid. Until you replace it with like your tier belt. Yeah, but you see, I played TBC Classic a lot. I still remember a lot of loot stuff. So the progression is kind of different actually than Classic. So you would start out maybe here again. You would enter phase 1. The phase 2 gear is pretty much better. Then the phase 3 gear is massively better, and Sunway again is massively better again. So yeah, you would have that. That's pretty much true for like TBC. However, again, we have certain item in earlier phases which pretty much trump everything else. So for example here we would have DST, which is relevant until Sunweb. I can just type it here, SVP. This one would be Kara. This looks horrible. Karazhan, Gruul, and Mac. And here we have SSC. Oh, I think I made a mistake. Did I? Didn't I? Yeah, I forgot to face. So yeah, perfect, really perfect. So let me do this again. So we have this one, we have, I think, a small upgrade, I would say, and then you have a massive upgrade, and we have another massive upgrade, which is even bigger. So yeah, so we would here, let me just type it like that. Phase 1, phase 2, this one is phase 3 and phase 4, and this one is phase 5. So yeah, that's how it goes. So phase 1 we can get some items, phase 2 we can of course get some items. So this one would be like SSC, like Calfas and so on, and Serpent Shrine Cavern, Tempest Keep. This one would be Karazhan, Groot's Lair, and so on. And this one would be Black Temple. That's also why the increase is bigger. And then we have Sunwell Plateau as the last one. But yeah, you will see like the gear progression is more, I would say, more evenly balanced. It's not, for example, like we had in Classic WoW. However, we still have, which is kind of true, I think it's even like more, it's even more heavily emphasized. Like the big ticket items are even stronger in TBC, I would say. Besides maybe Thunder Fury. But yeah, so if you get, for example, DST in phase 1, you are good for the whole phase, pretty much. Same thing if you get Belt of 100 Deaths. You won't really replace it with anything else. Phase 3, we have a really big ticket item, like actually 2, but we have of course our glaives, which go even way above Sunwell. You won't replace it in Sunwell. So yeah. Again, we have really big ticket items. It's kind of more sparse, so there aren't a lot. There aren't that many, but we still have it. And that is a thing that is, again, very important. What this will lead to, again, when we are in phase 3, you will still see people doing phase 1 content. You will still do people doing phase 2 content just to get either this item or that item. And as well, when you are in phase 5, we will definitely see people still doing this kind of content for this. If you don't know what that is, these are glaives, of course. What I mean by that, of course, is actually Warglaive. Warglaive. Of course, Warglaive of Azinov. The legendary weapons you can get in TBC, which are just very insane, of course, and they are best in slot for the whole game. And they are still even useful in Rev at the start while you are leveling and so on. But yeah, these are very insane. This one would be 100 deaths. So the belt I showed earlier. And this one is DST, which is this one. And the belt is this one. Well, this belt is very strong because it has a lot of expertise. which is kind of a rare stat you can get. Expertise is pretty much the replacement for weapon skill, but yeah, that one's not really important right now. But what I mean by that is, this looks like such a mess. I should have used maybe different colors, whatever. You will have people doing older content in later phases, which is again very important for new players. I already talked about this. But yeah, this is also very healthy for the game in general. You always want to have people doing a multiple of different rates. You don't really want to have people doing, I would say, like doing only the newest rates, because it is pretty much wasted. Because why would you do that? Like, you design a raid and then the next raid comes out and no one should do the last raid anymore. Like, how that is such an awful design and such a big waste of resources. Actually, you still want to have people doing like the older raids, and that's one way you can actually ensure that. You can also introduce things like mounts. In classic, of course, we don't have things like badges, where we can actually, when we are clearing something, we get badges and we can exchange that for some additional gear. That one got introduced in TBC, so you will also see people doing that to get some badges, to get some additional gear. That's also a thing which is in later expansions as well in Wrath of the Lich King, which got like further incentivized on that as well. But yeah. Another thing which is important, in TBC we also have heroics, which will play a pretty big role in phase 1. To do the heroics and so on. And another thing which is also important, which I didn't really talk about here, because it isn't really loot related, you have attunements. And all of this pretty much ensures that people will run dungeons and do all the raid content, just to have that ready. So that one is definitely really important. Good. So that is the thing. So you can see in TBC they still have that, I would say, that kind of classic loot spirit in mind. You still have these really big items that are still very important, and you still of course want to get them and so on. And that dominates the whole phase. So you could get lucky in phase 1, get DST, and you're pretty much smooth sailing. You don't really need to get another trinket. Of course, you need to get another trinket in that other trinket slot, but one trinket slot would always be DST. Until you enter like the last phase. I think that is very cool, actually, and very like good game design. I think it's pretty fun to chase these very big ticket items. And you will also have, of course, people doing like older content as well, helping newer players, inviting them, giving them all of the gear they don't really need because they have like way better gear, but they still want to have like that DST. That's why they do the raid. But the newer players can, of course, benefit from that as well. So now let's look at something. Let's look at some changes. I would say in Wrath of the Lich King is where everything got turned. Everything changed pretty much. The loot changed. I think the whole game kind of changed a lot. First thing, of course, stats got massive stats on items and so on damage, and everything got highly inflated. If you compared my example again, I said Classic and TBC has kind of similar damage numbers, but if you enter Wrath, you will see people doing like 20k DPS and so on. So it's massively different. A lot of stuff got changed in Wrath of the Lich King. We of course also got like new talents and so on and whatever. But they introduced a lot of stuff in Wrath of the Lich King, which is still true till this day. And they also changed loot massively and how you actually acquire it, how useful loot is for like the different phases. And that is like something I want to talk about on here as well. So one thing that is very important to mention, we of course again have like heroics and such we can do. So that would be where we would start getting our pre-raid lists and so on, and then we won't enter raids. But let me just draw it again. Draw like the different steps and so on. So you would start out maybe here. This is just for raids. I don't really include dungeons that much unless it's like maybe for classic because that's really relevant. But then you would enter Nex, which is like a big upgrade from dungeons. Then you would enter Uldua, which is again a bigger upgrade. Then your GC, and then we have ICC, and then you have like Ruby Sanctum, but that one, who cares about that? Yeah, we have that. So again, you can just type it here: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. This one is like the tiny phase 5, but not really. It's not really a new phase. Yeah, just maybe 4.5 or whatever. That one's not really that important. What I can say, however, is now you would think, okay, now I need to add like the big ticket items. So let me add that. Let me add the big ticket items. I'm kinda losing place here, but yeah, that's it. There's nothing else really. You don't really have items in Wrath of the Lich King which are really strong for multiple phases. No, people would probably say, okay, that isn't really true. When I played Wrath Classic, I got Waldruffer, and that one was best in slot for a lot. And I would say, okay, that's because they increased the item level gear of that item. So that one was not really originally the case in Wrath of the Lich King. So one thing that is very important, which I kind of forgot to talk about as well. Now we get into a topic which pretty much pertains to this issue, where we have item level and gear score. So in TBC and Classic WoW and Vanilla, I would say, this one doesn't. These two don't matter. You can go right now in the game, and you see like no one really advertises anything about gear score. You don't have pucks also, or hosts mentioning anything about gear score. They are just talking about being like fully consumed and so on, like having all the world buffs and so on. In TBC, it's also the case, because the gear is so varied actually. Because some of the pieces, they don't really have a lot of item level and gear score, but are still your best in slot. And that is, I think, very interesting. For example, you have like, this is like the pre-bis for the Burning Crusade, like TBC. And you have this weapon, which you get from a quest. And it's a green weapon. So it doesn't really have like the highest amount of things. You would say, okay, it's a green weapon. Why? What does a green weapon do here? But yeah, it's actually best in slot because it has a lot of good stats actually. And that is a thing which is, I would say, true for Classic and so on. And yeah, for Classic and TBC. So you won't really see people grouping people by gear score and so on. It still can be kind of useful, but not really. Moreover, people will look at logs, they will look at consumes and so on. Because that's like the more important stuff, like the more important matter. However, in Wrath of the Lich King, they kinda changed their design perspective on gear. In that is, by that what I mean is, earlier things you can get in earlier raids will pretty much get replaced when your new phase comes out. So let's say you get your best in slot items in phase 1, in phase 2 everything gets kinda replaced, same with phase 3, same with phase 4. That was their design perspective in Wrath of the Lich King. Which is, I think in my opinion, pretty big problem. So you don't have big ticket items. You could maybe make an argument for Grim Toll, but this item doesn't really get used until later. And that is the same situation where I also didn't mention Badge of the Swarm Guard, which is a very strong item in TBC and not really used in Classic. But it's the same situation here. Because like the armor penetration rating is not really useful at the start, but later it will become useful. But still we have some alternatives for this item which are pretty much better than this one anyway later. So yeah, it's not really, I wouldn't say it's really a big ticket item compared to something like Spine Trophy or Onslaught Girdle or something. So yeah, these things don't really exist on here. Yeah, you have that. So that's, I think, kind of sad. You would maybe get all of your gear in phase 1, then you would enter phase 2 and you pretty much replace everything again. That is, I think, a pretty big problem with how they designed the game. That's also where eye level and gear score by then become very important actually. Because a person who has like a higher gear score than another person pretty much has better gear. You could say, okay, that's also the case for classic WoW, but not really that much. However, here it really makes a big difference, just because of the high focus on eye level. An item that has a higher item level than another piece on the same slot, and is designed of course for the same class, is probably going to be better in most cases. This isn't the case in earlier expansions, in like classic and in TBC. Again, I say classic is an expansion, but you know what I mean. However, in Wrath of the Lich King it is. Like here, I think it started actually, like the high focus on item level, I think really started in Wrath of the Lich King. I think that's where it really mattered. That's also, why is that a problem? I could say, okay, I can replace, on every phase I can replace my whole gear, that is very exciting for me. So I don't need to sit around with one item for the whole game. I can actually replace everything again, which is fun. Yeah, why is that a problem? So this actually introduces multiple problems. So the first problem, I always talk about new players. Let's say you are a new player. When you are entering in, let's say, phase 3, so you are entering here, you will pretty much only see people doing phase 3 content. There are some limitations. Maybe they will do the hardest content in phase 2 as well. So phase 2 is Ulduar actually. So let me do this. Ulduar. And this one is TOGC. Just so you have some idea. But what won't happen is you won't see people going to do phase 1 content. So they won't do Nex at all. They won't do Ulduar at all, pretty much. So this doesn't happen anymore. So if you are a new player and you want to do these raids, you're kind of screwed. You will see this a lot on private servers where no one's really doing these raids, and there are some different solutions to that. This is actually a very big problem in Wrath of the Lich King, where different people tried different solutions actually, even Blizzard, to fix this. So back then when the game released, when TOGC got released, it got flamed pretty hard. Why was that the case? Pretty much everything in Ulduar got replaced with this tier. And what it meant is TOGC is not the best raid. It is, I think, kind of boring. It isn't that bad, but yeah, compared to Ulduar, it really is not the discussion. I think they got pretty lazy actually in Wrath of the Lich King when they made raids, but whatever, that's maybe another discussion. But yeah, this one is pretty bad, and now you can imagine people were having fun in Ulduar. It was like pretty difficult, and they got gear and so on. Everything gets replaced in TOGC, which is way easier. And yeah, all of that didn't really matter anymore. People got, of course, mad, justified, of course, I think as well, because everything got replaced. So in Rev Classic, what they did is they increased the item level gear of Ulduar. So the gear is a bit higher than TOGC. Like the hardest raid content gear you can get in Ulduar is actually a bit higher of an item level than TOGC. What item level does is pretty much only like increases the stats of the items, and however Wrath of the Lich King is pretty much a stat. Like stats are very important, and this of course made it so the items are actually better than the TOGC gear. However, like only like certain stuff. I will talk about difficulties and so on as well. But yeah, that was their fix in Wrath of the Lich King. Some private servers do it where you have to complete the raid tier before, so you can actually do the newer raid content. That's one thing. Other things are maybe they swap around the phase releases and so on. Like there are a lot of different solutions. However, you can see it's actually a big problem, and people, even Blizzard, acknowledge that. You didn't have that in earlier iterations of the game. When phase 3 launched in TBC, no one was like, oh man, we can't really, like the phase 2 content is kinda, we don't really need to do it anymore. There was still like some stuff in phase 2 and phase 2 content which was still very, very good actually. So people still did it. However, that didn't really happen in Rise of the King. Which is pretty much my point I want to make. This again leads to a problem for new players as well. People not doing the older content anymore, and you have that focus on just the new stuff as well. And of course also gear score and item level becoming more and more important. Another thing is you could say, okay, Grim Toll, good item. However, I think, which is pretty funny, it gets replaced by actually a dungeon item. So you don't have long-lasting items as well. So items don't really last as long. So you could get your best in slot items in phase 1, but you could pretty much replace your whole item set in phase 2. Which I think is pretty bad actually. Like, what's even the point of doing raids when everything gets replaced in the next phase anyway? Yeah, which is not the case, again, as I said in previous expansions. If you got a DST in phase 1, you pretty much kept it for the whole game. There wasn't anything better. And yeah, that is not the case in Rise of the King. They pretty much changed that. Another thing, let's go to, I think I talked about this. Let's go to the actually another thing which is really important, like how gear actually looks like. So why is it important how gear actually looks like? I think, of course, it's very good if you see someone on the overworld, see someone who raided a lot. I think this was even more important, like back in the day, you saw someone with like a lot of raid gear, and to see, oh, that guy has like Meledeth, he has chromatically tempered sword, or maybe he has a Thunder Fury, you immediately recognize these items, you know what these items are, and that is actually pretty cool, like a pretty cool concept of an MMO, seeing what people actually have for gear and so on. Same thing with TBC, you have a lot of different items you immediately recognize. I think in TBC even more so. In Classic we had some reskins, for example Whiskeg looks very similar to Dolrent. It is pretty much Dolrent just reskinned, it's just a red version. But yeah, still we had a lot of unique models, so if you saw someone maybe with a Brutality Blade, you knew what it was. Perdition's Blade, you knew what it was. Unique model and so on. Meledeth as well. There's like one reskin, but it looks like a lot different. But yeah. In TBC the same thing, I would say even more so. They really had like unique models. I think only in the latest phase where you had stuff in Sunwear which looked very similar to the PvP gear as well. Which just was a different color. But yeah, for example, we of course have Warglaives. If you saw someone with Warglaives in TBC Classic, you knew, okay, that guy was either very lucky, had a lot of gold, because GTKPs were a thing, or yeah, they were very good players and their guild gave them the weapons. Another thing, for example, this sword also looks very amazing. Like the gear, I would say the gear looked the best in TBC. It actually looks very insane. Classic has some really good looking items as well, as like Thunder Fury, but TBC is where it's at. Like a lot of the gear looks very insane in TBC. Even like the tier pieces look just very good. So what happened in Rev? This isn't really a Rev bashing video, but Rev introduced a lot of stuff, which is pretty much what I mean. So we have this sword, for example. This sword drops from one of the hard modes in Ulduar and was like your best in slot weapon in phase 2. It's a very strong weapon, and yeah, pretty much looks like this. So now you could say, okay, this actually looks like a very cool sword. Really fits like the Ulduar thematic and so on. But one thing that ruins it is we have a lot of items that look very similar to this and are pretty much reskins. So for example, we have this item which drops from Yogg-Saron, the last boss in Ulduar. We have another item like Azir's Edge. Let me go. Yeah, if it actually shows up. Yeah, this one, which is pretty much also looks very similar, just another color again. yeah, this is like, I think, very disappointing, I think, kinda. Because if you saw someone with this weapon, maybe you would say, okay, oh, this weapon looks kinda reddish, so, okay, he has like the best installed weapon. The other one looks kinda bluish, that one is a different weapon. But it isn't really that pinpoint. You would see like maybe a guy with, for example, okay, Thunder Fury is a bit unfair, but let's say with Meledeth, and you would see, okay, that guy has Meledeth, I know, 100%. There isn't like another weapon that looks very similar to that one. There's like one, but it is pretty much green and drops from a world boss. So you would pretty much immediately see, okay, it's not that one. But yeah, that's like a thing. You also have this weapon, which is pretty much a similar story. A lot of different weapons like are reskins in Wrath of the Lich King, and that's where it pretty much started being the case. I think it even started in like Sunwell in TBC at the end as well, with like the PvP gear being very similar. But I think that's very disappointing. There's another thing that's very important about the gear being distinct and unique, so you actually have people looking at the gear and say, okay, oh, I know what gear that is, and so on. So yeah. That is that. Another thing which got introduced in Wrath of the Lich King, another thing, a lot of stuff got introduced are hard modes and so on. And multiple difficulties. So in TBC we had heroic dungeons, which were a new thing where you kind of did the dungeon, like the same dungeon, but it was more difficult and dropped way different, actually different loot and so on. And heroics were very, very fun in TBC. They were actually difficult and kind of challenging, and yeah, especially at the start. I really liked doing heroics in TBC. But in Wrath of the Lich King they even upped that. So in phase 1 it was pretty similar. In phase 2, so when Ulduar released, oh man, I don't know why I'm doing this all the time. Oh, so Ulduar released. And what we got is, we got hard modes. Hard modes, what hard modes are, is pretty much you could fight the boss in a certain way, and you would activate a hard mode. And hard modes are pretty much harder version of a boss fight. They have some additional mechanics. And however, one really important thing, they were pretty much the prototype heroics for raids. One important thing is you needed to activate it while doing the fight pretty much, most of the time. And hard modes also gave you new unique gear. That is very important. Like it was actually not unique. Different gear actually. So yeah, it was that. It was different actually. So you got actually different gear from the boss. Similar, we had things like that in Classic as well, where in AQ there's like the bug trio you can fight. And depending on which bug trio you kill last, you get different gear. This is kind of the same thing they did in hard mode, but of course more expanded level. So this was for Ulduar, and this is like an Ulduar exclusive thing, because later they even changed that again and didn't use hard modes anymore. One thing they also did in Rev Classic is massively increase the eye level of this gear. Because if they didn't do that with the next phase, why would you try to do like these hard modes that were actually difficult as well, if the gear just gets replaced in the next easier phase anyway. So yeah, that's the thing they did in Ulduar. So that was kind of a thing where you could actually increase the difficulty and get different gear. The gear from the hard mode was also way better and had higher item level as in the normal gear. So for example, this sword dropped from General Wessex, but only if you did the hard mode. So if you didn't do that, you couldn't get this sword, which is one thing I need to mention, which is very important. I personally like hard modes. I think they are the more healthier version compared to doing like heroic raids. Because first of all, you get new different gear, so that's one thing. You actually need to do something in the raid So for example, in there was like one boss in Ulduar, like that big robot guy. I think it was like XT something, whatever. And there's a phase where you can actually attack his heart, and if you kill it, you start hard mode. So the boss would get way more HP, it would be more difficult to fight him, you get some additional mechanics, and that's like one of the ways you can actually get hard mode. Another hard mode which I also really liked was like Forum. No, it wasn't Forum, it was Holdir. So on Holdir, you actually needed to fight the boss, and you needed to kill him very, very fast. If you did that, you could loot an additional chest, which would give you some additional items, and that was like the hard mode. But yeah, it was kind of different for every boss. I think I really, really liked that. It was very creative, actually, from the developers, what they actually did, and especially for that time. So yeah. However, what they changed with the next phase, they pretty much threw everything out of the window, and they just introduced heroic versions of raids. So instead of doing anything inside the raid, you could just have a setting similar, pretty much the same thing as you have with dungeons, and you can set it up on heroic, and so you would do the heroic version of the raid or a heroic version of the boss. Of course, the bosses would get like new mechanics and so on that would be more difficult. However, the gear mostly stayed the same, and what got changed is, so this, let me give you an example. So we have this sword which drops from the Lich King in ICC, like of course the last boss, on normal mode. So if you do it on heroic, what you would get instead is you would get this sword. So I would say, okay, what's the difference? It looks the same, kinda. It has like one slot more, but otherwise it's pretty similar. Yeah, that's also the case. What they did is pretty much, of course, they increased the item level, and they increased the stats by a lot, and maybe gave it like another socket or changed the sockets. But that's pretty much it. Nothing else really. And that's true for the majority of heroic items. You didn't really get new stuff, just like bigger stats and so on. And for this weapon, it got another visual, so it was like red instead of like blue. But yeah, I think that's pretty disappointing, because it was like with hard mode you actually got new gear, which was different, but this is just stats increases, nothing more. And that got introduced in TOGC, so in phase 3, so after Ulduar, it got introduced. And that is the case still to this day. It's pretty much true to this day. I personally really don't like multiple difficulties. I think hard modes are okay, they're good, but like having multiple difficulties for raids is not something I really like. Especially in like the retail environment, you have LFR, you have normal, you have heroic, you have mythic. So yeah, a lot of difficulties. I don't really like it. I personally am more of the fan, release the raid, and of course have it decently balanced, and if you can clear it, you can clear it, if not you can't. So that's pretty much that, which is kinda crass, you could say, but I think it's more an easier cop-out for developers, where they can pretty much make the raid easier for people and they don't really need to balance it a lot. But yeah, that's just retail stuff. Okay, so I have that. That's pretty much how the gear was in Wrath of the Lich King, where it got changed. So we have a lot of changes. In summary, I think Classic and TBC has a lot of similarities between the loot, and Wrath introduced a lot of changes which kind of diminished the identity of a lot of items. I think that is one thing where it pretty much started. So things like having a lot of reskins, having multiple difficulties, so you get the same weapon but just with some additional stats. What else? Not really having big ticket items which are strong for multiple phases. So yeah, a lot of problems which the modern environment has. Classic right now doesn't have it. The loot is handled pretty differently, and also I think when we enter TBC, same story. we have things like DST which we can get in phase 1 and we are good for the whole phase. Things like that don't exist in later expansions anymore, which I think is pretty sad, and really diminishing that power and pretty much like mic'd off like certain items where you got them, they had the name, they had the identity, and then you were pretty much set. I think it got changed. Like I think DST is pretty famous example. I think one of the lead developers, I forgot his name, Ian something. I think he's also like the CEO right now. I think he said on one of the interviews he did like Groot Slayer so many times for DST, but it never dropped. I think in like multiple weeks and so on, and that's something he never wants to experience again. And that's probably also, I think, like one of the reasons they probably changed it, because it can be very frustrating for people who don't see the item when they do like the raid for a very long time. But I think still, I think it's still like there are more advantages even with that, because what would be like the opposite of that? The opposite would be you do a raid. There are like no really highly big ticket contested items. The loot is kind of more boring with that, and everything is kind of the same. And yeah, of course that is like the way worse alternative. So I would rather have an item which is like maybe hard to get, but it actually exists and is in the game. And if you get it, you get a huge power boost. That's pretty much what DST does. It gives you a huge power boost if you get it. Compared to something where you do raid, every gear is like kind of similar, and it gets replaced in the next phase anyway, and yeah, whatever. And you get one new piece, you don't really care about it, because maybe it is like a couple of DPS. Yeah, and you replace it next phase anyway. So that's one thing I wanted to mention here. I wanted to talk about, and that's pretty much how the gear changed in, I think, like Wrath of the Lich King and so on, and the later expansions. And yeah, why like gear and loot and so on is so fun actually in classic WoW. And because and why gear actually it's actually been remembered, or why people actually know about certain gear and so on. They actually know the names and so on, and they don't really in retail, because pretty much multiple expansions and so on, and what they did is this led to that situation where you have like a lot of gear, you have a lot of inflation of gear, and everything's kind of similar to each other, and you don't really have anything that is kind of stands out. But yeah, that's pretty much that. That was like the whole video. I think it was like pretty long discussion, but if you have any other opinions as well, feel free to say something. This was more of an improvised, spontaneous video, like no script, anything, nothing. But I think it's pretty fun to talk about things like that as well. So yeah, as always, if you like these kinds of videos, feel free to like and subscribe. Other than that, I will see you on the next one. Goodbye.